To order, I would like to start this session of the International Development Select Committee, where we are focusing on the current humanitarian situation in Sudan. Thank you so much for the witnesses for coming both in person and virtually. Could I ask you to introduce yourself? Claire, could I start with you, please?
Sure, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Claire Filippo with Doctors Without Borders, and I work as emergency coordinator for the Sudan and Chad operations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alsanosi, can I ask you to introduce yourself and your organisation, please?
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Alsanosi Adam. I work for the Cash Consortium of Sudan as a Operation Strategy Lead, and I also work for the emergency response rooms as the external communication coordinator with the LCC, the Localization Coordination Council.
Thank you so much. And Will, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thank you. I'm Will Carter. I'm the country director for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Sudan. We're an independent NGO, and I've headed the Sudan mission for the last 4 years.
Brilliant. Thank you. Over to Sam for the first question.
Thank you. It's to Ms. Filippo. Could you just explain to us the current humanitarian situation on the ground?
Sure. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, today Sudan faces one of the most devastating crises that the world has seen for decades. In a country which hosted 49 million people before the war, today more than half face acute hunger, according to the United Nations. The conflict has fueled the largest displacement crisis in the world, and over 11 million people, that means 1 in 5 people in Sudan, have been forced to flee their homes. These numbers are not what you would call sobering numbers, in my opinion. They're just unfathomable. And behind the numbers, there are people, and I think that's what I'd like to talk to you about. Last month, when I was in eastern Chad at the border with Sudan, I met numerous women, and some of them described their harrowing journey marked by violence, fear, and deprivation. Nadia, one of them, arrived from El Fasher in North Darfur, which, as you know, is currently besieged, with her 3 children. And she told me in no uncertain terms, and I quote, "Everywhere there is war. Everywhere, killings, bombings, shootings." She lost 8 relatives to the war. Everyone is starving. There's no food. There's no water. Children die. Virtually all the refugees who arrive at that border crossing, Tine, are women and children. Many pregnant women and many children are malnourished, and they had to rely on the generosity of others on the way. I saw their jerry cans, and you could usually see them with brown water, sometimes with algae. And this is just one illustration of the obscene violence and multiple health crises that the country is witnessing. In Sudan, virtually the health system has collapsed. According to the World Health Organization, 70 to 80% of the health facilities are not operating at full capacities in the areas most affected by the war. People access to healthcare has been dramatically affected by insecurity, critical shortages of medical staff and supplies, and increased cost of services and transportation, not to mention the widespread obstruction and looting of medical supplies that the warring parties have been committed since the beginning of the war. So what we're seeing on the ground is really multiple health crises, and I'd like to focus on just 5. 1, people continue every single day to die due to violence and violence-related injuries. In just one hospital that we support, Al-Bashair Hospital in the south of Khartoum, we have treated over 4,200 violent trauma injuries since the beginning of the year. That's 13 per day. And 1 in 6 is actually a child of under 15-year-old. We had an 18-month-old baby rushed into the emergency room after a stray bullet struck him while he was napping in his family home. This is the current types of injuries that we continue to see. 2, conflict sexual violence is shockingly pervasive, but medical care to respond thereto barely exists today. And let me share with you the horrific testimony of a South Sudanese refugee stranded in Nyala in South Darfur in a displacement camp. What she told us will make your heart break. She said, I was living in South Sudan, but at the time we arrived in Nyala, the war broke out and we just were trapped. I'm here with my children and I came to Kalma camp. There's no way for me to get a job. So I went from my home to beg for something to take to my children. And on the way back, I was walking. It was dark. 3 men appeared. They asked me where I was going and they wanted money, but I explained that I was just a beggar. Then they raped me. They held me strongly and they laid me down on the ground and they raped me. I don't remember anything. I woke up later on the ground and it was so humiliating for me, so painful. I talked to someone and they directed me to a women's clinic. I got some medicine, but I feel so sad. I feel destroyed. And this is just one testimony, a horrific one, but of an example of sexual violence that we know is pervasive in the conflict.
Claire, we've been told in past sessions that this is what's happening in Sudan is a war on women. Would you agree, disagree with that?
Unfortunately, violence against civilians is pervasive during the conflict. We see that there is no respect on international humanitarian law or an international human rights law. And we really see that everyone is at risk. Women and girls are at particular risk of sexual and gender-based violence. And what we see in our clinics is only the tip of the iceberg, because there are a lot of obstacles for women to come. Stigma, fear of retaliation, lack of knowledge about care. But women are definitely at risk in this conflict. And it's particularly important to flag this right now, as we are, as you know, during the 16 days of activism on to fight violence against women.
Thank you. Could I bring in Alsanosi? Same question, but also interested to know about the current access for aid, so humanitarian access, and if there are any blockages.
Absolutely. These are only, some of the crises that we witness, and be happy if you want.
Sorry, I think Sam had directed that to
So
Mr. Alsanosi.
Oh, sorry. No, my apologies. Thank you. I didn't hear that. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you, Claire, for your your information on this. And I think for us as emergency response rooms, so we don't have an access problem. We are the grassroots first responders. We are from these neighborhoods. We are from these areas. We're there. We're organizing to help our people. Maybe in terms of from international organizations and for the UN, there is a lot of access issues, especially to move massive amount of food and medicine across the country in cross-border and cross-line. We've seen that in multiple areas. I mean, just to add to what Claire has said on the actual situation on the ground, I just got out of a meeting where in Al Ubaid we're losing a person every 3 hours because of cholera outbreak. There's hospitals, there's no doctors inside these hospitals because the hospital simply doesn't have water, doesn't have electricity, and doesn't have any form of medication that can be used to save somebody's life. Doctors are sitting in their houses because there's nothing there. there's a lot of we know there is a lot of medical supplies sitting somewhere in Port Sudan waiting clearance for WHO to be transported across the country. And I think just a personal story. My aunt, 2 months ago, my aunt passed away in a hospital from a treatable disease, just because the hospital doesn't have the necessary medication, to use in the people. So this is where we're left up with. We're left up with just buildings and the access issue for organizations and for aid to actually reach out to states like the hard to reach out states like White Nile, like Kordofans and the Darfurs. It's just actually creating a very tough situation on the ground. In Jazeera recently, we had also another cholera outbreak, and that was not even a month ago, where 66 people died in a single day in cholera, and we were trying as emergency sponsors to respond to this, but unfortunately, there is no, there's no funding for medical for mutual aid. How medical aid is held to a higher standards, and it has to be MSF or WHO, but both organizations don't have access to these areas. And we've reached out, and they cannot do anything in these areas because they have to get access from authorities to reach these areas. So in the meantime, we end up with doing what we could with the resources we had, and with the amount of funding and like the mutual aid that we moved around to purchase, simple things like IVs, like whatever the doctors need to kind of hydrate these patients, and get them to a state where they could maybe not die. But we lost 66 people in that day. This is just really off of the top of what we're dealing with. Half of the population are under really harsh conditions of living. About 11.5 million IDPs are in really hard condition, even in the safe areas. So this is what we're dealing with, and I think, yeah.
So just checking from my understanding, then, what you're saying is, unlike some of the larger NGOs, as a local organisation, you're able to reach and access areas freely, but essentially you lack medical supplies, you greatly lack resources that you would need, and people are dying due to a lack of basic medical supplies, and they are being blocked from getting through to you.
Absolutely. Like we activate networks of people who are within these areas, who can actually, they want to help, but they can only do what they can within what they have. So with lack of medical supplies, doctors can't do anything. With lack of adequate funding, we simply can't move. I mean, we've been there's different modalities of kind of supporting mutual aid and the emergency response rooms on the ground, but these are actually within limited funding. So there is a huge need to actually to provide supply inside the country, whether it's cross border or cross line, get it to go to these hospitals, so that people could actually be able to do the work they needed to do.
Thank
so
you.
yes,
Thank you.
yeah.
I appreciate also getting Will and Claire's perspective on this as some of those larger NGOs that are working on the ground. Maybe we could start with Will and then come back to Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, to build on Alsanosi's answer, that there's some fantastic work done by Sudanese people outside of the formal system. And one of the, I'd say, good news stories in what otherwise is a pretty miserable catastrophe in Sudan is just how local groups, especially those led by emergency response rooms and other community-led and youth-led action, have really provided critical services like communal kitchens, like collective shelters, like emergency health continuity in some very difficult parts of the country. That's not without risk, though, and many of them have faced extreme safety and security risks as well. You know, that it doesn't stop them from delivering, but it is an aspect where we need to work together diplomatically in terms of how to provide safety and security support for frontline responders, including from the emergency response rooms. And that's something I think the UK can do much more of at a diplomatic and a programmatic level. On your question on access challenges, this is a system that has been set up in the government of Sudan to thwart aid efforts over the years. It started in the Bashir era under the Humanitarian Aid Commission, and it really was meant to thwart and divert humanitarian relief. And we still today face immense challenges with bureaucratic and administrative impediments from authorities in Port Sudan and other authorities that control territories in the country. You probably will have seen some of the higher level negotiations about whether cross-border access points from Chad or other places can be used to help with the famine response efforts in places like Darfur. Hugely politicized, very problematic, not insurmountable, and we have at the moment a UN-led system that continues to be paralyzed by a piece of paper using these bureaucratic impediments when on the ground there isn't anything militarily stopping aid from flowing to this response. There's a security issue. This is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for aid workers to go, of course, behind places like Gaza and Palestine. We have in the tens of aid workers being killed since this conflict has begun. There's infrastructural limitations. Sudan is a context where the capital city and all the ministries and telecommunications and banking and manufacturing and fuel supply was crippled when the capital city became a war zone itself. And so to get aid across this expansive country from Port Sudan to West Darfur is perhaps a 2,000-kilometre drive through multiple lines of control. It's just a huge logistical challenge to moving there. So bureaucratic impediments, insecurity, logistics, I think, have really stymied a lot of the international response. And so far, we have emergency response rooms and community and youth-led action working in some pretty hard places. We have excellent NGOs like our colleagues at MSF, other NGOs like our own. Just on Friday, I was in Darfur, earlier in the week in Port Sudan, but in the last few months I've seen the situation in Khartoum and the good work that emergency response rooms do there.
Will, what's it actually like out there?
It's a terrible situation in many parts. I was there.
We know that, but describe it to us. I mean, to be brutal about it, we know all the stats.
Yeah.
We've heard all the reports. So from your point of view going there, and I know you've been to various other places around the world, what's it actually like?
When I was in Khartoum, there was artillery being fired. And I saw communal kitchens still working to stop families from dying. And it's... I know in some ways it's terrifying for people, in some ways it's been normalized, but every day someone's dying there. Life is really on the line, and it's incredibly intense and stressful in many parts. And there's some brutal, awful atrocities happening in different parts of the country, including in Khartoum, not least to mention sexual violence. So it's a pretty terrible and terrifying place. And, as an aid worker, we're really trying to push there, but it's been infuriatingly slow to get the system to move and to scale up in places that are just about accessible, but there really isn't a response on the ground. So,
and how organised is the violence? We had a briefing yesterday from journalists that have been working out there, and we were hearing that little kids are going around terrorising. So is it armed forces in the way that we would expect them?
There's an urban warfare element to what is happening in Khartoum. There's airstrikes and artillery happening, but the social fabric of the country seems to be pulling apart at the seams. There's an increased sense of desperation with such low access to food, increasing criminality, increasing lawlessness. It's a scary place, and well, scary is an understatement, because people have been raped, tortured, disappeared, abused in a capital city, not less, this huge country. So it's an awful situation.
Thank you.
I have a question. I know that the famine has been declared in one region, but there are 14 more on the brink of famine. Can you give us any more information on that? And also, you talked about aid workers being killed or under threat. Do you have any figures on that, or can you give us any more colour on that, please?
Yeah. There's a catastrophic food crisis in many parts of the country. There isn't a good enough health observation system to get all the data that's required to formally determine or declare a famine in different parts. But there's enough, particularly in the largest IDP or displaced person settlement in Darfur, Zamzam camp, that was announced by the IPC system in August. But yeah, there's other areas where there's people in catastrophic phases of hunger, and that's as of now. We'll go through a weak harvest system, and we'll be again into another lean season in 6 months or so. So it was already in a very difficult place. We can't say precisely how many million people are at risk of catastrophic hunger, but it's going to grow. There may be slight ups and downs, but the trend line is not being abated despite some of the efforts that are at play. I should also say that our observation is a lot of the food systems, marketplaces, farms, farming infrastructure, seeds have been disrupted, destroyed by the conflict, sometimes intentionally, and aid is being blocked from areas. It's not just that there's a famine in different parts, there's a starvation strategy being waged, and I think the UK has also put a lot of effort into stopping this as a weapon of war, and the restriction and deliberate deprivation of food getting into places, and it's something that also needs to be diplomatically unblocked.
Thank you. Can I bring Laura in, please?
Yeah, thank you.
Could I jump
we've heard,
in on that?
Sorry, were you going to come in?
Is that okay if I jump in on malnutrition, just to complement and on the question of health workers? Yeah, because I couldn't agree more with what's just been said. I mean, what we're really seeing is that malnutrition is reaching terrifying levels in many areas of the conflict. Where we work, we've seen that in Zamzam camp, so in North Darfur, and in parts of Nyala, South Darfur, 1 out of 3 children screened face acute malnutrition level. To give a reference, this is twice over the World Health Organization emergency threshold. So this is really terrifying. And in Khartoum, we have now seen in just a few weeks over 4,000 children that were screened for malnutrition, and 35% were severely acutely malnourished. So the situation in terms of malnutrition in the country is one of the worst that we are currently seeing. And the second point I wanted to make is to complement what Will was saying about violence and about the question of the health workers. Violence remains a key challenge for the humanitarian response, because health facilities and healthcare workers have been affected, including those supported by Doctors Without Borders, but by many others. So we've seen health facilities that have been looted, occupied, that have been shelled. In El Fasher only, we've had health facilities shelled 12 times. And healthcare workers continue to be intimidated, harassed, assaulted. Some have been killed. And in Khartoum, in Al Bashair Hospital, we work with the emergency rooms and local volunteers. Staff work under extremely difficult circumstances, and we've just had to suspend non-critical activities for over a week because a patient was killed by a soldier inside the hospital. So health facilities that should be safe places for people to reach and have access to care are absolutely not protected. So this is a key concern beyond, of course, what Will has mentioned, and is very important, is the fact that the warring parties continue to deliberately block, divert, or restrict access to life-saving aid, and that's obviously choking a scale-up of the humanitarian response. But here I think that there's also a critical lack of response and scale-up by the international community at large, and that is a failure. And I think that here the UK has a role to play to make sure that the response is scale up, to call the UN to scale up the response, particularly in Darfur.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And I think we'll want to come back to those points. I just wanted to go back to the emergency response rooms, and we've heard some references to them and the vital work that they're playing. But Alsanosi, could you just set out for us, take a step back and set out for us how they work, who runs them, how many are there, what does the operating model look like?
Thank you so much. Well, I mean, we started the second week when this war started. From Khartoum, El Jarif. It's a small neighborhood, and the idea was really simple. It's our neighborhood. We know that more than 90% of the people who live there, they're working day to day, and in 2 weeks they would not have anything left really to kind of use that. And that's when the idea of this mutual kind of the first communal kitchen kind of started there. And then the idea is really simple. You bring it to the school, and then people cook food, and everybody will come together. We share a meal, and just kind of check on each other, and make sure that people are all right. And then it eventually started to become a very important thing. And then it kind of started into other places across Omdurman and Bahri, and and then gradually started to kind of all these small bases are started to pop up. And then there were need to coordinate this effort together. So we brought everybody together in online, on through WhatsApp, and we know the people who's in this neighborhood, who's there. And we've kind of brought people together into some sort of a coordination. And then we kind of talked about how we're going to govern this work, created a charter, and worked, we have representatives, and then we have, executive offices who do the work, communication, services, medical office, and communal kitchens, and all that. And then with the war expanding across Sudan, there was a need for us to kind of expand also across Sudan. So from Khartoum, we went to Jazeera, Sinnar, and now we work pretty much in all the states across Sudan, very autonomously, and very also, kind of this idea of voluntarism, this culture of mutual aid, and connecting the communities together. And it's really, this war, since it started, everybody, I mean, Sudan is, if you know Sudan, there is, 1% and 99%. This, the majority of people who are just working class, and the need of this kind of effort. And these are the members of these emergency response rooms are the people from within these neighborhoods. Nobody will go from his neighborhood to serve in another neighborhood. It's you're there, you coordinate, and what can you do? What can you do? What can you give to the community? If you're a doctor, you're enlisted into the medical office. If you can fix things, you go to the services. If you can, coordinate and arrange, and you do logistics and finance and stuff like that. With single donations from individuals across from diaspora, Sudanese and diaspora, and organizations after that, and now with all these modalities of funding. So the funding will go straight into the base emergency response rooms, and they do the design of the service they want to do themselves. If they want to do a communal kitchen, if they want to do food baskets, if they want to do, purchase some diabetic medication and give it to those who need it. So whatever they need to do, they do it. And the services we offer is kind of, it comes from the design of the community. Right now, we have women response rooms that kind of cater to also to women needs, because usually, the forgotten, when something happens, women are like usually forgotten into the design of things. So we've created that to kind of make sure that they're in the center of this response. We have child-friendly spaces where the children would just come while they're waiting for the food to be served or cooked. They, play and like share, like there will be somebody who teach them something here and there. And yeah, I mean, it's just kind of this sense of cohesion of the Sudanese people, brought people together in a good way, and it's like kind of
it's great
becoming
of that impact.
yeah.
Thank you. And can I ask, it sounds like they're not receiving a lot of international funding. Could you just set out for us what difference more support for the emergency response rooms could make?
I mean, there is funding right now, but it needs to be scaled up so that we can cover all these areas. Like usually, right now, because we have limited funding, it has to be split and kind of divided across all these units, and the people are now ending up has to like prioritize. Either they get quality food for 3 or 4 days, or they get just food, which is going to usually a single source food for a month. So and that is what people end up doing. And we're actually sometimes we've been discussing this in meetings. Like, all right, we have $5,000. Should we get just rice for a month, or should we get lentils and beans and stuff, and that will only last us for 3 or 5 days? And that's where the issue is. Like we need to be increased the amount of funding that we give to the units on the ground, so that they could actually do these interventions. And we had like a list of 10 different services that we would like to do, but because of the lack of funding, we literally jumping from area to area trying to provide the basic needs, which is food right now.
I think the work that your group manages to do is quite remarkable, and I think we'd be very interested if you wanted to write to us with the other 10 things that you could be doing, then that would be incredibly interesting for us. I think, Will, you're trying to come in on this point?
Just to add briefly, I've seen firsthand, and many staff have seen the fantastic work that community-led action, including ERRs, do. They barely get 1% of the overall humanitarian funds that are dedicated to Sudan. We give everything that we have flexibly that we can to them, and so far that's been maybe $3 million, and their absorptive capacity is much, much greater. I think there should be a much more diverse aid response funded, and really the local capacities that are already at play voluntarily, that have, to be honest, bankrupted the diaspora that have been partly supporting them when governments should have. This should be something that's corrected and improved.
Over to Alice.
Thanks very much. And just picking up on those points, I guess, and moving on to the kind of aid delivery in the UK's package in particular, you've obviously outlined some of the mechanisms where aid can be delivered and make the most impact, like the emergency response rooms. Maybe, Will, just building on your point, are there other mechanisms you would point to? There's a lot of talk about cash transfers, also using mobile money transfers. How sustainable are those mechanisms? Are they working? And building on that, maybe you can do two together, because I know we're a bit short on time. The UK's obviously just announced a doubling of its aid package for Sudan. So far, how have you seen that being used? Is it being used in the best possible way? Do you see in the future that being delivered in the way that's going to make the most impact? Any recommendations or thoughts around that?
Thank you. So the traditional response is not generally working right now. There's trucks being blocked from getting to places, and to be honest, what the UN is largely trying to deliver is being scuppered and blocked. You do have some great work done by some NGOs and, of course, the social movements and civil society there. And that's certainly something that should be further invested in. To credit the FCDO, they have begun to invest more in cash-based approaches, including with NGO. Much more can be done on this. It's not an easy response, but it's an important and scalable way. So much more can be done through cash and using market systems. Last week I was in Darfur. One of our responses is to work with bakeries. And instead of us doing, lining up 100,000 families for food aid, we're trying to support the market system. And the UK is having the thought leadership and technical experience to support these things, I think, is an area that can be leveraged. I'd like to see more of the aid work being coupled with diplomacy. We need diplomatic breakthroughs to get aid to where it needs to get to, and I would really recommend this committee to work with the Foreign Affairs Select Committee to push on that. I know that the Foreign Secretary was quite passionate in the Security Council recently, but we need to continue that pressure to keep all access routes open. But yeah, cash and markets, support with local partners, and lastly, different types of aid response, including with mobile systems and e-vouchers, I think would be important.
Thank you. That's an important point on diplomacy, which I know we'll pick up on. Claire, can I just get your reflections? And my other question, I guess, is how are you seeing, this might be one for follow-up, the UK's package and support and the programmes it's delivering in contrast with some of the other countries, perhaps in the EU, who are making contributions too?
I couldn't speak, too much about that, but as MSF. But what I can tell you is that it's very important to look at that in terms of how insufficient the response currently is. And I just wanted to give one statistics, which I think is quite telling. You know that the border crossing point between Chad and Sudan was opened for another 3 months and that by the Sudanese authorities, even though they do not control that border crossing, but that allowed the UN to make the decision to use the border crossing. But on average, there were only 3 trucks per day that crossed from Chad into Sudan. And just to give you a point of reference, we considered that we would need 1.3 trucks per day to feed only the people in Zamzam camps. So that's one camp in one town of one of the 5 Darfur states. So that's roughly up to 500,000 people, and there are 10 million people in Darfur. So it's really important to really push. So I can speak a bit more about politically, but politically for the UK to really push the UN to scale up their response in Sudan and in the neighbouring countries because of the staggering needs that we're seeing.
And I think we heard just before that 700 lorries have come in today. Are you feeling that things might be improving, or with that kind of announcement, or not really?
Well, I mean, 700 is definitely much better than 300 in almost 3 months. But it still is a drop in the ocean, given the needs in terms of malnutrition, in terms of health. There's really an urgent need to scale up, but also to have more, bigger, greater UN presence in Port Sudan, in both areas controlled by the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, and to facilitate access for staff and supplies for others. So there's, it's really important also for the UK to continue to make sure that humanitarian funding for Sudan is protected. So that's great to hear that's, it's increased. And I would definitely second the point about making sure that the funding is flexible and goes to local responders and also goes to the neighboring countries such as Chad and South Sudan, which are also bearing the brunt of the crisis in Sudan.
Thank you. And just one final question to Alsanosi. If there's anything you want to add in terms of how the response could be scaled up to you, that would be helpful. But I just wondered, in terms of all the people you're working with, what is their feeling at the moment? Obviously, they're doing a lot to deliver life-saving work. But are people hopeful that this might change for the better, or how are people feeling that you're working with?
I mean, the longer this war continues, the harder the situation is going to be on the ground, the harder would be on the people. I mean, it's been 16 to 17 months right now, and our life suddenly changed just overnight. And, you know, we are trying to sell hope to the people, to those who remain, to the 25 million who still remain in across Sudan. But I think, and we can do services, and we can do, we can meet for 7, 8 hours a night, and we can do all that. It's just, the longer this war continues, the longer this suffering continues. And I really urge, and echo what Will Carter said. There's need for diplomacy, also to kind of find a solution to this ever to this war. I mean, stop the war, stop the like maybe, or a ceasefire, so that humanitarian aid could reach to those who need it. We're actually, what we're telling you is maybe 10% of what is actually happening on the ground.
Okay.
Most of it's not being reported, and what because of the lack of connectivity, and because of other protection constraints and stuff like that, the situation is really way worse than what we're telling you. We are having these constant meetings on like strategizing how can we support, how can we do better, and we've seen it within we've seen the like the enthusiasm, the spirit of just of giving within the volunteers of the emergency response rooms. And we've seen how even when people, like, there's, and you can't do this for a really long time. Some people would just like kind of would have fatigue, and would just burned out, and they will go, and others will come and take their place. And it's just continuing from one single emergency response room to 700 across the country, to state level councils that governs the work of the emergency response, to the localization coordination council that has 16 local organizations plus 4 INGOs as observers, and 10 state reps and more are kind of joining every single day. So the movement is continuing, the support and the response is continuing. We need more advocacy, we need more protection to our people on the ground. And definitely, we know that cash works, and it's fast, it's agile, it's adaptive. That people would, they usually solve their problems. Whatever happened on the ground, they can design and they can solve it.
Thank you. Let me pause you there. Let me pause you there, because we've literally got 1 minute, and I've got other committee members that want to get in with their questions. So can I ask members to be brief, please? Passing to David Mundell.
Hey, thank you. Claire, could you just, I think you were about to touch on it, what the effects of this crisis is having on the region and indeed globally?
Yes, unfortunately, what we're seeing now is really a regional crisis with far-reaching implications, both for the people displaced out of Sudan and for communities that are hosting them. And maybe just to touch upon South Sudan and Chad. So South Sudan, as you know, before the war, obviously the country was obviously facing a humanitarian crisis with 75% of the population depending on aid. There are now almost 900,000 people crossed from Sudan into South Sudan. So that's a 7% population increase. And just the sheer amount of additional people exacerbates the challenges that were already existing. Many people arrive injured and acutely malnourished. We very much, are present in South Sudan, and once people arrive, they face a very difficult situation with little food, water, or shelter, and transit centres that are overcrowded and presents limited access to services. So what we're particularly concerned is the lack of access to water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities in these transit centres. And the result of that is that cholera is spreading. Since end of October, the South Sudanese Ministry of Health declared a cholera outbreak in Renk County, South Sudan, and we've seen hundreds of cases in Renk and in Malakal, that is located 300 kilometers away from Renk, with people moving in South Sudan from Renk and then possibly onwards to Malakal and then across Upper Nile states and other parts of South Sudan. The cholera outbreak obviously poses a risk of spreading way beyond these two locations. So that's of serious concern.
Thank you.
We also work.
I'm going to have to stop you there.
Sure.
Yeah, is there anything more that the UK could be doing to support these other, these countries neighbouring Sudan?
Is that directed to Will?
That's directed, Will and to Claire.
I'm pleased to see the doubling of the aid package, and I think it can be used to even better effect. But there's a regional crisis growing, the refugee movements and onward migration. I think that this is a critically underfunded crisis. I would want to see how the UK is supporting or pushing for other member states, the system, to also mobilise similar resources in the coming year, because we're facing a cliff edge, not just for Sudan, but when I was there in Chad last week, people are moving because they don't have enough food in the place they've just sought safety to, and they're moving Libya and onwards. So I think that there's much more resource mobilisation support that could be done, not only from the UK, but to now encourage everyone else to step up. I think that there could be a greater investment in regional leadership of this crisis. The UN system has not been able to stand up and look at a coherent response to what is happening across 7 or 8 different countries. So I think there's some key roles that the UK can and should play.
Leah?
I absolutely agree with everything that's been said, and maybe just to continue to judge, yourselves and the UK government to put and keep Sudan and the regional crisis on top of the political agenda, and make sure that the UK government is using its influence, including as pen holder on Sudan at the UN Security Council, to engage with the warring party in Sudan, and very importantly, the states with influence on both sides, to seize all attacks on civilians, respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, and grant immediate, unhindered humanitarian access. This plus, urging the United Nations to find ways to immediately scale up their response, both in Sudan and in the region, and making sure that funding is flexible, as we've discussed, would definitely be tremendously helpful.
Well, we are trying, which is why we're having this session today, so I can assure you of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very mindful of time, so just building on David's last question, what sorts of principles and areas of focus should guide any future Sudan strategy? And if we could just have a few broad themes with time in mind. So if we can direct that to Claire first, and then open it up to Will and Mr. Adam as well. Thank you.
So, obviously looking at the conflict, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is absolutely key. At the same time, it's also very important for humanitarian actors that the discussion of ceasefire and ending the conflict is not a condition for humanitarian access. Humanitarian access unhindered to deliver critical humanitarian aid through all possible routes. That means both across borders and across front lines, needs to be a top priority. Another issue is the immediate and unconditional lift of all blockades and bureaucratic and administrative impediments pertaining to humanitarian access. I do realize that when we talk about administrative and bureaucratic impediments, it sounds like a civil kind of obstacle that someone has misplaced a stamp, but really here we're talking about systematic and deliberate obstructions by the warring parties, particularly to prevent moving supplies from the areas under their control into the areas that are controlled by their opponents in the conflict, but also within the areas that they control. So I think that's that's a key principle to look at. And the last one I'd like to flag is the respect of obligations under international humanitarian law and the fulfillment of the commitments under the Jeddah Agreement.
Fantastic. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
Mr. Carter and Mr. Adam.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the UK's doubling of aid, I think, should be placed where it matters, and I think that it should be structured in a sense of going to actors that are operationally present. We're 19 months in, and the UN hasn't reopened bases in Darfur, in Khartoum, in Kordofan, in some of the worst conflict-affected areas. We have MSFs there, we have emergency rooms, we have other NGOs, but I think the aid really should go to where it counts at the right time, and there should be leadership from the donor community, especially led from the UK side, on it, accepting the right level of risk, having that risk appetite to do the right thing despite the complexity and challenge that is there, because so many lives are at stake at this point in time. Agree on Claire's point on protection of civilians. The UK is penholder at the Security Council. I think there must be a coherent approach in foreign policy strategy, and that includes how you deal with some of the regional powers at play. Some of them are allies of the UK, and they are on different sides of this conflict, this internationalized internal armed conflict. And we have to have a much stronger voice on this topic. And I'm very happy that the Foreign Secretary has put Sudan as a priority, and I think it needs to be followed through now with just how firm that's going to be with some of these allies that are perpetuating this war.
Thank you. Mr. Adam.
Thank you so much. I'm actually just echoing what Will said. I think we need a breakthrough in the political file, because that will affect the way we can do this humanitarian aid on the ground. We have right now 4 different areas of control in Sudan, and it's proven difficult every single day, but people are pushing, I think just to that, also to the issue of the risk appetite, I think we need to find a way to support mutual aid groups on the ground, because they're the ones who are right now doing the work, doing the heavy lifting. They're the ones who are there and very neutral in these across all these areas, even in Nuba Mountains and in Jabal Mara in Darfur. And yeah, I think the funding needs to go to where it will count most value for the funding that goes there. And I think we need to be to advocate more for the protection of frontline responders, the emergency response rooms, the mutual aid workers on the ground. The protection need to be advocated for strongly within both SAF and the RSF and the other areas of controls as well.
Thank you, Brian.
A further question here, which was, are there any other countries' responses that have worked well, which the UK could learn from? Perhaps start with you, Will.
I'll be frank, I haven't seen a strong approach from the humanitarian donor community. I do think the UK still has the thought leadership on it, and I'm glad that there's a bit more resources. The US has tried to double down on support for local responders in a more meaningful way, but still quite insufficient. I believe the US is also investing in alternative or complementary models of aid outside of the UN system, or complementary to it, including alternative pipelines for food and medical supplies to get into difficult parts of the country. The EU is invested even more so than the UK into cash and vouchers-based assistance as a scalable modality. But I look at the US and the EU and the UK as perhaps three of the main sort of leaders in the donor community, and I think there's a bit of learning to do, but I think a bit of leadership within good humanitarian donor practice to make ground on as well.
Right.
Well, panellists, thank you so much for the evidence you've given me. I'm sorry that I sort of whizzed you along a little bit. We would like to have spoken to all of you all day, but we have got other witnesses. Can I say, if you could please share with your colleagues our gratitude for all you're doing under the toughest of circumstances. We do admire what you're trying to do, and we're just sorry that you're in this situation that you have to. We'll keep on trying to shine a spotlight, and we'll keep on highlighting the good work that you're all doing. Thank you very much. Could I ask the next panel to come forward, please? We also have Dame Rosalind, who's online. I believe, Dame Rosalind, are you there? And if I could ask Dr. Kate and Dr. Eva to come and sit in front of us, please. Dame Rosalind, we can see you. Can you see and hear us, or maybe just hear us? Dame Rosalind, can you see or hear us?
I look at the US and the EU and the UK as perhaps three of the main sort of leaders in the donor community, and I think there's a bit of learning to do, but I think a bit of leadership within good humanitarian donor practice to
very much
make ground
for
on this.
coming here.
Right.
Dr. Eva,
thank you so much for the evidence you've given me. I'm sorry that I sort of whizzed you along a little bit. We would like to have spoken to all of you all day, but we have got other witnesses. Can I say,
I mean, it's a joy to hear my nasal tones. I'm not sure it's overly helpful. Dame Rosalind, can you hear us? Okay, I'm going to, if the team can try and get in touch with Dame Rosalind, and I'm going to start because of time. Ladies?
We're ready.
Thank you very much. I wonder, Eva, if you could introduce yourself and the organisation you're here representing, please.
Of course, thank you, Chair, honourable members. Colleagues, my name is Dr. Eva Khair. I am the director of the Sudan Transnational Consortium, a body of civil society, Sudanese activists, as well as other allies coming together to work internationally on the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ferguson.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kate Ferguson. I'm the co-executive director at Protection Approaches. We've spent the last 10 years working to strengthen UK contributions to the prevention of identity-based violence and specifically mass atrocity crimes.
Thank you. Dame Rosalind, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Dame Rosalind, your CV entered the room before you. Which hat would you like to wear for this committee session?
Sorry, in what sense?
Who are you?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I am an associate fellow at Chatham House attached to the Africa programme. I'm a former British and then former European Union diplomat, and I've been working on Sudan since around 2007.
Lovely. And you're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, all panellists. Can I hand over to Noah, please?
Hi, Dr. Khair. So, firstly, wanting to hear from you a bit more about the makeup of Sudanese civil society, both prior to the war and now, and the role that it plays in the response to the crisis.
Well, thank you. I think the first thing to do is possibly to step back, if I may, and sort of talk as to the context in which Sudanese civil society has been the last generation, sort of 30 years or so, and even slightly earlier. In a country where sort of health and education, enjoyed less than 2% of the national budget, it sort of paints a picture to what extent civil society has offered that social assistance safety net, civic education, democracy, human rights, all of that has really lain with civil society. One of the issues that we have at the moment is that we are in a situation where that's not really recognized. Sudanese civil society are not really at the forefront of engagement, either with the sort of increasingly with the international humanitarian system, but certainly not with, let's say, international bodies, countries, diplomatic processes, mediation, and so on and so forth. Excuse me, but Sudanese civil society has for a long, long time consisted of various groups and collectives, whether national NGOs, grassroots collectives, sort of structures around university, sort of unions and bodies, collectives that deal with any emergency that comes up, floods, outbreaks, even things like community organizing for funerals. And when I say Sudanese civil society, I really do take a very broad definition of what that is. Sudanese civil society is absolutely global. It is not defined by borders. I and my colleague in the LCC and the ERRs, we are Sudanese civil society. And that is part of the point here, that it is not just in Sudan, it's not just the displaced, it's at the borders, it's in the near abroad, and it's in the diaspora. So it's a slightly broader definition than we normally take.
Thank you. And what role do you think why is it important that they play a part in this response? Also keen to hear from Dame Rosalind on this as well.
Of course. Since the outbreak of this war, we've seen obviously the emergence of these mutual aid networks, and that has been really a lifeline, a critical humanitarian lifeline for provision of services, anything from, as you've heard in the previous panel, health, wash services, shelter, soup kitchens, and so on and so forth, documentation, human rights monitoring, and of course, also in the comms, media, journalism, there's a lot that has been taken on by Sudanese civil society because there is this historic pattern of, sort of state oppression and kleptocracy and state abandonment that has meant that Sudanese civil society over many, many years has proliferated to take up that space, and I would arguably say to do the role of the state.
And Rosalind, can I bring you in on this? How do you see that role?
Well, to build on what Dr. Ava has said, I mean, I think that the Sudanese civil society, Sudanese diaspora in the UK really should be seen as a very important asset. For example, for the FCDO, because they are a very large and influential group, and they can shed light on what is going on in the country. There are human rights activists here amongst, for example, the Sudanese doctors. There are Sudanese civil society groups who are very active on the humanitarian front, and all these groups can really sort of make a useful input, I think, into British policy making. Also, to give an example, I know that there is a very large group of Sudanese doctors in this country working in the national health system, many as consultants. And I know, for example, some of them were quite keen to go and volunteer to help Sudanese refugees in need of medical assistance in the border areas of Sudan, those in Chad or on the Egyptian border and so on. And I think they encountered some difficulties in managing to deploy as part of an emergency medical team. So these are the sort of issues where a sort of structured engagement with the Sudanese diaspora would be really useful. And then I just wanted to mention one particular group of Sudanese civil society and political actors who the UK has been supporting, which is the Coordination of Democratic Civilian Forces, known as Chatham. They don't represent all Sudanese civilians, as they would readily acknowledge, but they are probably at the moment the most active and visible group, which has a political vision on how they think that the war could be brought to an end and democratic governance supported. They're prioritizing humanitarian assistance and protection of civilians at the moment, which I think is welcome. And they could also offer, I think, advice and experience on structuring the mediation process. But from which I think, as Dr. Ava mentioned, the Sudanese civil society have been largely excluded. But UK support to civil society certainly shouldn't be limited to a group like Chatham. We've obviously heard in the previous session about the importance of emergency response rooms, but there are also many other very active Sudanese civil society groups working on human rights, documenting violations, developing options on protection of civilians, working on peace building at local level. All of these groups can also make a very important contribution to easing the sort of suffering of civilians on the ground. And I think it's very important that the the UK, the British office in Addis Ababa, and also, the Sudan team in London should, be in touch with as many of these as possible.
Thank you. That very much brings me to my next question. I mean, could you describe how the UK government has been, in your view, Dr. Khair, has been engaging with these kind of groups, and how you think they could perhaps go further?
Thank you. I think the first thing to say is that the Sudan war is both a foreign policy and a domestic issue. That is, really important, I think, to get. And we really need cross-government working and understanding and engagement with sort of the Sudanese community in the UK and broader Sudanese civil society. On the foreign policy side, things were better before the war. They, in the development stream, things were better when we had DFID. Things were better when there was a dedicated envoy. And the change across all of those spheres has really seen a tumbling, in not just my opinion, but those of our networks and our colleagues who are right now on the ground doing the brunt of this work. It's sort of a real detachment. And I think, as Dame Ros says, we do need to see more steps. And even if there is will, that is welcomed and absolutely encouraged. But it might be a resourcing and a strategizing sort of piece that would help to unlock some of that engagement. On the domestic side, I'm by no means an expert on sort of domestic policy and how the Home Office might run in relation to that. But I think some of the discontent for Sudanese civil society is, we don't see Ukraine-like schemes for Sudanese. There are no homes for Sudanese on the .gov website. There is no family reunification that was sort of, even momentarily to allow people to come in and to be supported by their relatives. Instead, people are trying to support people in Sudan on a border somewhere or in a sort of second country. And when it comes to new arrivals, migrants, accompanied, unaccompanied, minors, not, that is a whole body of work that, our colleagues are fantastic at documenting, and it's just travesty after travesty. And we just don't feel that. There is some local engagement, city to city, but not necessarily at the sort of the national level. So I think there's a lot of work to do there.
Tariba, the UK pulled out of Sudan in 1957, I think it was. Do we have a special responsibility when things like this are happening?
I think it depends on how you look at sort of more recent engagement than that, rather than going back to 1956. And so, for example, when we have the Khartoum process, right? Sort of EU, UK, we were all friends back then, designing a sort of migration control, border control, outsourced border force out in the desert that puts money into the hands of one of the current belligerents of the conflict. Absolutely, there is a responsibility. Besides the fact that any war that is happening on this scale, the largest, the biggest, the worst, all of the superlatives, I would find it strange to imagine that the UK, sort of, a multilateral, well-known actor with the kind of moral and, I suppose, rights-based rhetoric that we sort of enjoy, I would say, that we would look away. So even if I wasn't here on behalf of Sudanese civil society and as a particular type of stakeholder, I should think we would not look away.
And are we stepping up and not looking away?
We're looking. I'm not sure that we are, and we're doing, but maybe a little bit behind the scenes. And I know there will be questions on the diplomatic engagement, and my colleagues can certainly, Dame Rosalind can speak to that very, very well. But in terms of sort of surging and not being back of the room diplomats, but actually being at the forefront, we've seen some very, welcome moves in the past month with the UK's UNSC presidency. There's been a lot of action and a lot more engagement and sort of meaningful talk. Regardless of sort of what happens along that, what we need to see is with, for example, the work of the current incumbent in the envoy, to actually see that engagement, to see the engagement on multilateral fora with Sudanese civil society, wherever we are. And for those engagements not just to be social and visible, but to actually have meaningful policy change as well.
Yeah, and can I, at this point, bring in Dr. Ferguson? So I mean, what is your assessment of the FCDO's capacity for this kind of engagement? We've had many constructive suggestions.
In terms of the diaspora and civil society?
Yes, and where could improvements be made?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the big challenges, and this is an FCDO structural challenge, this isn't particular to the Sudan team or the geographic, is that there tends not to be an emphasis placed on creating formal structure where civil society can engage with the Foreign Office. And this has in part really been deconstructed and dismantled under the last government, and it starts right at the top. So one of the first things that the Labour government could do is to reconstitute the Human Rights Advisory Board, which William Haid set up, which advised the Foreign Secretary at the highest level to ensure that human rights was integral to the Foreign Secretary's consideration over a matter of issues. Then you come down and you start thinking about particular crises. It seems... And of course I'm biased, I'm a human rights activist on the outside, so I would say this, but I do find it difficult to understand why a crisis as enormous as Sudan, which as Eva says, it's the biggest protection crisis, it's the biggest everything, it's unfathomable. There isn't a mechanism by which the Foreign Office is able to regularly reach into Sudanese expertise in the civil realm to draw on their expertise and knowledge. And we know that those most proximate or closer to the challenges that need addressing have the answers that others don't. But it's also a challenge of civil society writ large. I will say that, my organisation and a huddle of us have been working actually extremely constructively and with very positive results with the Sudan team at the Foreign Office and other compartments. So it's not that there is an unwillingness to work. I really do think that it is an issue of capacity and perhaps of how engaging with civil society is understood. And again, not to blame everything on the last government, but there were repeated ministers who denigrated the role of charities, of human rights and of expertise. That broke a lot of trust. And so I think that, coupled with the fact that there's no formal mechanism, the US, for example, the Sudan envoy meets monthly online with civil society. I'm not suggesting that is a perfect model, but it is an example of demonstrating a willingness to engage. There are also examples that we can use from the Foreign Office's own best practice. When the FCDO did its own internal lessons learned following the genocide in Myanmar, in Rakhine, they really realized that they'd missed a trick, similar to Sudan, where the warnings from those that knew that were most proximate were not filtered through and did not inform policy. And it's that difference, right? It's not just listening, it's making sure the knowledge is informing policy development.
Dr. Kate, can I push you a little bit on that? Because you worked with this committee in the last Parliament on atrocity prevention, and we used what happened in Myanmar and in Bosnia as examples of what should happen, and there's meant to be an atrocity team. So I know that the CSSF fund that was going to Sudan was cut, but we still have the atrocity prevention team. And when we were in Bosnia as a committee, we had one of the mothers say the simplest way to discover when atrocities are happening is follow the movement of people. It's 11.6 million internally displaced people. So what did you see FCDO doing when those people started moving?
In Sudan? I don't think I'm probably the best person to fairly ask, but I think that from London at that particular period, as I've said in front of other committee hearings on Sudan, I don't think that those warnings were necessarily appropriately heeded. I don't think the Foreign Office on the whole has the means of receiving that kind of warning. The warning systems that exist within the Foreign Office tend to be based on things that are treated as quantitative rather than qualitative. So how people feel is not necessarily as easy to pass up the chain of command to trigger response. And that's a fundamental problem that the new atrocity prevention team that sits within Whitehall, within the Office of Conflict Stabilisation and Mediation, are looking at, right? That's what they've been tasked with doing, is thinking about how that can be rectified.
This isn't about 11.6 million people feeling bad. This is about that number of people physically moving from their homes, and that's hard.
I mean, that is feeding into, you know, the government's analysis, and they are better abreast than I am of those kinds of movements for sure. I think it's more around, to me, what the gap that has been frequently and not only on Sudan missed is the nature of the violence. And I was sitting into the session prior to this, which was really an extraordinary insight into the humanitarian consequences of what's happening. But I think it's worthwhile us stepping back to remember that there are three forms of crisis taking place in Sudan. One is the armed conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF and their varied support networks. There is also, though, particularly but not only in Darfur, deliberate strategy of identity-based violence that breaches, I would say, crimes against humanity and genocide, that is seeking to remove, in whole or in part, populations, which requires a distinct response to the armed conflict. That's what I think really holds opportunity to be drawing on Sudanese expertise, both on the ground and in the UK and everywhere else in the world, in terms of what can be done to assist the immediate protection of those civilians at risk from both forms of violence, as well as the humanitarian consequences which are themselves being weaponized as tools of both war and of identity-based violence. So I think that's the gap. And it's not necessarily just the scale that needs to resonate, because I think the Foreign Office are well aware of the scale. I think it's more, can our government benefit by creating better channels of communication and expertise that draw on civilian and civic knowledge, both in the UK and elsewhere, towards policy development. And that's the gap that exists in our Foreign Office at the moment. And again, not just on Sudan, but on a number of protection crises where it's no one's job to develop those policy options. And it's civil society that can help.
Let me pause you there. I've got Sam and I've got David and I've got Brian who all want to come in with supplementaries.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about identity-based violence and to what extent in Sudan are we seeing violence that is distinctly identity-based as opposed to political? And then a sort of follow-on from that is, to what degree then is there resistance and peace movements, grassroots, that could be better supported?
Fine. Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you'll well know from your own work the long histories in Sudan of both identity-based violence and then also of political conflict, and the fact that these are not always easy to separate, but that actually one has to recognise and differentiate between situations of armed conflict when you have hierarchical and recognised armed combatants that are engaged within that framework, and violence that is targeted deliberately towards civilian populations. And that is distinct from just looking at violations, right? And so I think, you know, we can look at individual incidents to determine whether they are violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and so on. But actually what's very important is that we recognise that that distinct pathology of violence that targets people because of their real or perceived identity, which is happening in Darfur by the same perpetrating structure that committed the same kind of violence, just less effectively, 20 years ago against the same population groups, requires a different kind of response to conflict prevention. And so while we may well all in this room have views on efforts towards a ceasefire that is essentially focusing on the armed actors in the conflict to halt that situation, that is actually never going to resolve a different typology of violence that is seeking to advance largely, but not only, RSF aims within Darfur towards cleansing certain geographic areas of people. And that's the bit that requires a different focus. And that's actually where I think the UK has shown important leadership at moments, and where, you know, I'm grateful to this committee in past sessions on Sudan of really focusing on what can be done and maximising there.
Thank you. I think as to the sort of the ethnic, let's say, driving forces that are slightly distinct from sort of, bygone haphazard fire or conflict related violence. The drivers of it, this is an unfinished war in certain parts of the country that started a long, long time ago. And in others, there is a sort of increasing polarization. The longer the war goes on, we are seeing, people, first of all, completely becoming disenchanted with the revolution, losing hope, wishing for the better days of living under dictatorship, all sorts of concerning features. And when it comes to how we know that there is a difference in the violence on the ground that's just bullets and guns and that which is targeted, everybody is potentially a conflict actor because we are all armed with telephones. And social media is a massive part of this problem. Incitement, misinformation, disinformation, and harm. And in terms of engaging, as the UK, civil society has been at work, since COVID on misinformation around health. And so there have been apparatus that have been already, already working that now just switched to dealing with this kind of incitement and working with, the big social media platforms to work on that. I heard tell recently that 2 of the most prolific sort of, inciters of hatred and conflict that is ethnically driven live not in Sudan, but in Western countries. And that is something that we can hardly say is a problem of over there. Mm-hmm. So working with actors who can bring these, I think being savvy as to who is operating online, who has reached the UK and further afield, that is some of the work of, as I say, sort of foreign policy, but really tapping into the domestic concerns up to and including the Met Office and others.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Weber, just on that, so was that Sudanese citizens in the West or Western actors?
Sudanese in other, I couldn't speak to their citizenship, but they're Sudanese, they're part of the society and they are instigating or propagating hate speech.
Which platforms is this propagating?
Everyone you can name, every single one. It's, besides the, youth are not the only people who use social media. I think the context in certainly, where I've worked in Africa and other parts of the world, sort of, WhatsApp is the email service and, Telegram, Facebook, Instagram, everything that is able to transmit information is essentially a potential, platform for abuse.
Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Yes, perhaps this question is for you, Dame Rosalind, because it's just to get the context, because, we've discussed the impact on Sudan's neighbours, but the one neighbour we haven't talked about is Egypt. And, the main news story in the UK today is about British tourists being in Egypt, not that distant from where this conflict is taking place. So what is the role of Egypt in these circumstances?
Well, Egypt, together with, like some of Sudan's other neighbours, has been receiving huge numbers of Sudanese refugees. And that has come at a very difficult time for Egypt because of its own quite severe economic problems. Some of the Sudanese refugees who are in Egypt, have been encountering quite serious problems in terms of their own livelihoods, in terms of getting access to education for their children and so on. So there are quite a lot of issues there. On the broader political picture, Egypt, I think, is broadly, widely perceived as being basically supporting the Sudanese armed forces and the authorities in Port Sudan. For Egypt, Sudan has always been seen as a very important national security concern because obviously it has a very broad, very long southern border with Egypt. And broadly speaking, it would like to see, I think, the Sudanese army, the Sudanese armed forces remaining as to be the sort of lead state institution in the country. Sort of rather, they have a strong historical link with the Sudanese armed forces. At the same time, for historical reasons, I think Egypt also feels that it ought to be playing probably the leading role in the future efforts to decide the future of Sudan. So they have, they have also, like certain other regional countries, also been seeking to play a prominent role in the mediation process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. 5 years ago, there seemed to be a real chance for a peaceful sort of democratic way forward in Sudan. There seemed to be a flowering of something which so many of us were feeling was really exciting. Then that bird flew. Hopefully, one day we'll get back to that. But in the meantime, we are where we are, and there's this god-awful civil war happening. From what we heard yesterday, the situation seems in some ways to be better under the Sudanese army controlled areas than it is under the RSF, which seems to be really terrible. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that was the reflection that we had. But if that is the case, civil wars are often the most awful conflicts which can go on and on. Is there any semblance of a thought that perhaps if the Egyptians are backing one particular side, that maybe what needs to happen is one side, and hopefully the better side, needs to win and then start again?
Who's that directed to?
I think let's go to...
I think you were looking directly at me.
I was.
Of course, Dame Rosalind absolutely must weigh in. If I may make a few comments to begin with, there is no better side.
Okay.
All are oppressing, all are raping, looting, causing, atrocity, violence. The sort of the SAF, which is, let's say, it's not the government, it's the last man standing of the previous administration. That's essentially what it is bombing hospitals. It's doing whatever it can to attack civilian infrastructure, as long as it gets, the other man, as long as it gets the other side. In terms of even protecting civilians, a declaration was signed last year in Jeddah. We haven't seen any meaningful progress towards implementing that. There is rhetoric around this sort of, one public, one army, this sort of united front, civilians with the army. But I unfortunately have not seen that play out on the ground. The recent defection that we saw from an RSF commander back to the Sudanese army created absolute havoc and I'd say crimes against humanity in Al Jazeera state. That was a perfect moment for the army to step in and show that they are defenders of the peace, that they are defenders of their territory. Instead, they spent a week or so or longer raving on social media about having their man back, while the rest of us were treated to atrocities on social media. Where was that protection? Where was that responsibility? This is the same apparatus that was responsible for state abandonment for a generation. Have they changed overnight? I don't think so. And this is not a happy accident. It's a tactic of the war to ensure that people see how terrible the RSF are. We are the better option. And I think what we mustn't do is play into that. We need to be very, very careful about it. And just on the phrase civil war, it is not a civil war. It is a war against civilians. It is an anti-revolutionary war. It is payback for you daring to dream about democracy, about human rights, about any kind of progress. And to your point, Chair, about the role of the UK and other actors who first of all banished the youth who were at the front lines and said, no, you don't understand politics, stand down, stand aside, and asked for military guarantors to the transition period. So absolutely, the UK is involved in this. We are threaded through it, and really it is a war against civilians, and any non-civilian actor must be addressed as, unfortunately, the enemy.
Powerful clip. Dame Rosalind, what do you think?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what Dr. Ava has said. I think there are 2 points I would want to stress. First of all, don't underestimate the role of the Islamists and the hardliners from the Bashir regime and the deep state which they created over 3 decades, which is still, which after the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Force conducted a coup against the civilian transitional government in October 2021, those old regime elements have come back in force and, are now playing a very, very dominating role in Port Sudan. So I would say don't be tempted to take sides with either of the warring parties. If you want to take sides, the UK must take sides, as I think it is, with the civilians who are who led the revolution and who are committed to the goals of the revolution: freedom, peace, and justice. Perhaps just to elaborate very briefly, I think given the mass atrocities which the Rapid Support Forces have committed on the ground, and obviously we've heard about the ethnically targeted killing, burning of villages, sexual violence, looting, and so on. I doubt if any Western government would contemplate siding with the RSF after that record. But equally, as Dr. Ava said, there have been very many atrocities also committed by the other side as well. The Sudanese Armed Forces is working with Islamist shadow brigades like the Al-Bara bin Malik brigade and others from the old regime. And both the RSF and the SAF are both products of the Bashir regime. So we're not really talking about a national army that is a non-partisan state institution with a mandate to protect civilians. It's been heavily politicized, particularly since 1989. It's basically, its military strategy so far has been largely to sit in its garrisons and defend them rather than protecting civilians. And now, it's absolutely true that when the Rapid Support Force claims to be protecting democracy or to be fighting the old regime, that there is no foundation to this, because clearly, if you're committing mass atrocities, this disqualifies you on the first count, and there are also members of the old regime inside the Rapid Support Force as well. But what we can see is that the Sudanese Islamic movement, headed by Ali Kati, and leaders of the old regime who are indicted by the International Criminal Court, like former President Omar al-Bashir, they are supporting the Sudanese armed forces. And I think the idea that if the SAF were to win a sort of an outright victory, that we would have a period of stability in which we could talk about a return to civilian rule, couldn't be further from the truth, because what we would see is a return to the Bashir regime Mark II, set on revenge. And I think we would no doubt witness a mass campaign of arrests and executions against the forces of the revolution.
Rosalind,
and this would not just be the political actors, but also the emergency response rooms and so forth.
I'm going to stop you there because we're straying into speculation, and we're also going into the Foreign Affairs Committee's territory. Monica, over to you.
Thank you. Dame Rosalind, I'm actually going to come back to you. I just want to turn to our role as penholder on the UN Security Council and the opportunities that presents for us in the UK for a diplomatic response.
Yes, thank you. Well, the UK has used its position as penholder as an opportunity to raise the profile of the Sudan crisis. It's called for cessation of hostilities, protection of civilians, scaling up humanitarian assistance, and it's condemned violence against civilians and external interference that's been fueling the conflict. And it's also tried to use its position as penholder to ask the UN Secretariat to do some serious preparatory work on options for monitoring and verifying, on monitoring and verification mechanisms for protection of civilians. But because the UN Security Council has for a long time been so divided on Sudan, it hasn't been easy, as we know, to get resolutions through. It took almost a year into the war before the UK got a resolution, the first resolution adopted, which called for a ceasefire during Ramadan, and we know that didn't work. And then there was a second resolution in June this year urging the Rapid Support Force to lift the siege of Al-Fasher, and that had no impact either. And this was largely because the resolutions did not provide for any effective implementation mechanisms. And as there were no consequences for the parties, the conflict parties basically just shrugged them off. So we've also seen a lot of international statements of condemnation, but unless backed up by concrete measures and the threat of real consequences, there hasn't been much change. Now, the draft resolution that was co-sponsored by the UK and Sierra Leone and vetoed by the Russians last week would have been, had it been adopted, a significant step forward, because it was asking the Secretary General to develop an implementation mechanism to ensure compliance with the Jeddah Declaration of Commitment on Protection of Civilians in Sudan, which was commitments made by the two parties last in May 2023, but which have been completely violated by both sides. And of course, the Russian veto was obviously very disappointing and has set an unfortunate precedent, leaving the Council rather hamstrung at the moment in an attempt to deal with the Sudan crisis. But today, I understand that Russia is expected to go before the UN General Assembly to explain why it used the veto. And it's hoped that members of the UN General Assembly will encourage members of the Security Council, including the United States, who hold the Council presidency next month, to return to the issue of protection of civilians and try and press again for a robust mechanism.
Thank you.
Can I come in on that, please? Because I think that actually, I always agree with everything that Rosalind says. So this is yes and. I think actually there have been moments of real leadership that the UK has shown in holding the pen on Sudan. And I think really the challenge is now how can that be kept in momentum? We and others were working, I think, in very constructive contact with the FCDO around May, when a number of us were extremely worried about the intensification of violence in and around Al Fasher, which we remain. And, I think the only reason that city hasn't yet fallen is in part because of the leadership and diplomatic moments of surge that have come. And so we know that when that diplomatic surge came in May, and I will give credit to then Minister Andrew Mitchell for his role in doing this, we know that the fighting in Al Fasher for a period paused. The RSF stopped for a little moment. They also paused in June when the resolution that the UK secured regarding the protection of civilians in Al Fasher was adopted. That didn't necessarily prevent the whole trajectory of what is still happening there. And that city and nearby Zamzam is absolutely in peril. But in those days, people were able to leave and diplomats were bought more time. And that was, in part, massively because of UK leadership stepping up. And they raised their ambitions. There was some hesitancy, I think, of going forward for a protection of civilians resolution, and they did it. And so I think the challenge is seeing the prevention of these enormous crimes, not as ever a single act, but in the building of momentum. And where the UK has sometimes perhaps not been where I would like it to be, is where that momentum hasn't been there. And so it's fantastic to see David Lammy and the Security Council robustly calling out Russia for what it is doing. And I very much hope that signals a greater commitment in consistent momentum, because that's how it can live up to that penship. That's how it can take it forward, and not only in the Security Council, but actually in the spaces outside. And so the fact that the UK holds penship for both Sudan and the protection of civilians, and actually unlike other actors that are very involved in the pursuit of peace in Sudan, are not involved or invited to the Jeddah process or the Alps, the fact that they sit outside those ceasefire efforts gives the UK an opportunity that I do genuinely think is unique to take a leading role outside of the Council on the protection of civilians and on atrocity prevention, which is one of the 3 priorities that the UK has in its Sudan strategy, to be engaging with the African Union. To be supporting the Special Envoy of the African Union on the prevention of genocide and other mass atrocity crimes. Give them a new budget line. That is not anywhere close to the big programmatic needs on the humanitarian level. That is nothing close to the political scale of challenge of getting a protection of civilians force, on the ground, which is needed. Resource the African Union to be doing this work and work together in that way, and those creative avenues towards upholding that responsibility, I think, could have real impact on the ground, as well as in that trajectory over the next few months and years.
David.
Just building on that, Kate, what you talked about the work in the UN, but you also went into some detail there about the things we can do outside of the UN as a government. Can you talk a bit about the work that perhaps we could do with some of our allies to put some pressure on them to play a more positive, less harmful role in there?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And I mean, I think, if the government is choosing to prioritise Sudan a bit differently, and if the Foreign Secretary really is alive to this challenge, which we very much hope is true, it doesn't just sit to the Sudan team to do that. And so that prioritisation needs to be integrated into a whole of FCDO strategy. Sudan needs to become a top 3 diplomatic issue on every single brief. And the different geographics, the different ministers and the different ambassadors need to know what those lines are. And really what we need to be looking at there is mapping the architectures of that violence that is being enabled from all sides. David Lammy was quite right to call out Russia's behaviour on the continent and in Sudan. There are numerous networks of state and non-state, military, economic, communications and political architectures, networks, whatever you want to call it, where the UK could map and track those points of leverage and condemnation. And every, maybe not every country in the world, but there's going to be few influential states within the MENA region, within the continent of Africa, and also within Europe, where there's not going to be some things that states could be doing differently to prioritise that response. And then the last thing I'll say especially is there needs to be focus on those backers that are not upholding the Security Council arms embargo on Darfur, which does need to be expanded for the whole country. And if we're talking about the protection of civilians, if we're talking about an end to this violence, what we really need to do is be hitting the phones to the UAE to say, can you please ask the RSF and, to step down, and then to be doing the same for those that are engaging and backing the SAF. And I think, again, the UK could really be stepping forward to that. And a revision of the Sudan strategy, for example, could embed that. The last thing is David Lammy's excellent relationships within the Commonwealth. And I think that is an untapped space, as well as looking towards the African Union and African partners, but exploring that leadership and collaborative problem solving that is distinct around the protection of civilians and atrocity crimes, as opposed to getting involved in internal conflicts and civil war, which is another reason why we want to be careful of that, the kind of problems that labelling uses.
Thank you. Right? No? David?
So lots has been mentioned already around what could be done in terms of a future Sudan strategy, but is there anything else that anyone wants to bring in? Dame Rosalind, Dr. Eva, Dr. Kate?
Yes, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I've got several things. On protection of civilians, one way forward in advance of achieving some sort of cessation of hostilities, which obviously we should also be really pushing hard for, would be to consider setting up a protection of civilians coordination mechanism, which could provide support to local de-escalation and ceasefire initiatives and early warning mechanisms, including by sort of mapping credible local initiatives and learning lessons from what has worked in some parts of the country on the ground. So this is something the UK could consider perhaps looking at, working with Sudanese civil society groups who have networks still in the country and with any interested international partners. On other aspects, I think the UK, given its close historical and people-to-people links with Sudan and the expertise in this country on the subject, I think it would be important that it is playing an active role in the peace process not of course in terms of launching some sort of unilateral UK mediation initiative, but playing a more active and visible role as part of a core group of key international and regional actors. And the UK could start to do this by trying to revitalise important diplomatic mechanisms which in the past have been very active on the Sudan file, like the Troika, the group in which we're joined with the United States and Norway. The UK could also encourage the UN Secretary General's personal envoy, Ramtan Lamamra, to promote better coordination of the regional and international mediation efforts. At the moment, there's been a multiplicity of uncoordinated and competing mediation initiatives, which have created space for forum shopping by the parties to the conflict. Also, I encourage the diplomatic its international partners to listen and consult the sort of democratic civilians who have experience on these issues over quite a long period of time. It would also be valuable if the UN Security Council seems to be, for the time being, a bit deadlocked, to pay more diplomatic attention to the African Union. I mean, Kate rightly mentioned the Foreign Secretary's links with the Commonwealth. The African Union hitherto has not played a particularly effective role. I mean, it tried to put itself forward as a coordinating mechanism, but that hasn't really worked up till now. However, I mean, the current AU leadership is nearing the end of its term, so we will wait to see what might change in early next year. But where there is a deadlock in the UN Security Council, it's sometimes the case that if the African Union Peace and Security Council can adopt a resolution, for example, advocating for a robust protection of civilians mechanism, then this puts greater pressure on anyone in the UN Security Council not to use a veto against what the African Union itself has recommended. I think that in addition, as has already been mentioned, the UK could consider doing more to persuade some of the regional countries, Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia and others, that everyone will lose out in terms of their economic and security interests if this war continues. And this will require perhaps greater political engagement at a ministerial level, raising Sudan higher up the agenda in their discussions with their counterparts from those countries, as well as perhaps also having more expert level discussions to try to see whether it would be possible to reach more of a mutual understanding of what the dynamics, the conflict dynamics really are. And then, I mean, just a sort of final point on this.
Briefly, please.
It is very important to sort of see more high-level political attention given to the Sudan crisis. We're very pleased to see the Prime Minister mentioning it in his speech at the UN General Assembly, and obviously the fact that the Foreign Secretary chaired the Security Council during our presidency, and more high-level political attention will in part will also generate more international media attention, so thereby creating a virtuous circle.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jameson.
I mean, I've definitely got a couple of suggestions. I know time's tight, so I'll just do one
Bring new points to us, not ones we've already heard, please.
Sure. So I think, one is going to be very specific, which is in line with what this committee has regularly asked for. And I just suggest you sort of reiterate and re-up those regarding the atrocity prevention capabilities, especially around this structural gap that is really still there around whose job it is to be developing prevention and protection options. And I think that could do an awful lot. Just looking at whose job it is. Will, on the last session, said it's aid as well as diplomacy. And the diplomacy bit is cheaper, but it still does need human resource, and sort of the overstretch and demand of the team, at least from our view, it needs some greater support, and that OCSM team that essentially this committee sort of has been such a supporter of needs to be boosted. The second thing I'll say is much more high altitude, and I think that this really came to light from the Foreign Secretary's remarks in the Security Council last week regarding that veto, which it is increasingly, whether it is Sudan, whether it is Gaza, it is becoming so evident, whether it is Ukraine, the deliberate manipulation of inconsistent application of international rules, the rules-based system, and the weaponization of those who are accused of double standards or in fact are upholding double standards, and the perpetration of atrocity crimes has become a cornerstone of malign modern statecraft. However, despite that being so evident in the challenges that the UK faces, how the UK government currently confronts that challenge is in the margins, and actually recognising the dire threat that the rules-based system is facing, and recognising just how essential the weaponisation of and commitment or committing of atrocity crimes is in that furtherance. You need to have, right in the heart of our foreign policy, that commitment, which means number 10, it means the Security Council, and it means the Foreign Secretary is getting the advice on that. And currently that doesn't yet exist. So that's my very specific and top line.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I think, Dame Ross has spoken very well to the sort of the diplomatic engagement side. I think we do need to look over the pond and be very aware of the timelines there. We have a change in government, change in administration, a US envoy whose role is about to retire mid-Q1, and there won't be anybody in until Q3. That is a long time in a war. So we need the UK's envoy to be ready to not just take over at that point, but to already be doing some of that handover in the meantime, and to really meaningfully pull up on that. In terms of the civil society space, we need to see HMG engaging civil society, having an open door policy to learn from civil society allies and Sudanese civil society wherever we are, and to really work in partnership. As David Lammy says, there is an approach to work in partnership with African countries. We would like to see that in play, and one of the ways that can be done is through a diaspora engagement framework. There isn't one in the UK. That is something that needs to be looked at. We have many colleagues, including Kate's organisation and others, who have fed into the government on that basis. Recognition and support of Sudanese civil society is crucial. Recognition and protection of ERRs, mutual aid groups, local responders is absolutely critical. They need to be seen as humanitarian responders wearing blue vests or whatever colour, as we always see on television. That needs to be sacrosanct. Funding, flexible, sustained funding to local groups. And the key piece to this, the diaspora action, the civil society action, the humanitarian assistance piece, is localization. And that is firmly within this government's remit. And when it comes to ceasefire, local ceasefires, subnational peace building, protecting local actors, flexing and funding local actors, including their networks outside and those of us who work within them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies, you've been incredibly powerful witnesses. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and thoughts. We do deeply appreciate it. We're now going to a private session, so order, this session is now closed.